Today we are mainly going to be focused on romantic love and the neural mechanisms of romantic love. I want to acknowledge here at the outset that most of the studies of romantic love have focused on monogamous heterosexual love. And also when we talk about studies focused on desire and attractiveness and attachment, that's also the case. And that simply reflects the general bias of the literature over the last 50 to 100 years. It does, of course, not rule out that similar or different mechanisms could be at play in non-monogamous relationships, in homosexual relationships, or in relationships of any kind or variation. It's also worth us defining our terms around desire. It can mean lust. It can mean the desire for long-term partnership. So we need to define our terms. And throughout, I will do my best to very carefully define what I mean by desire, what I mean by love, and what I mean by attachment. The formal study of love and desire and attachment goes back to the early 1900s. One of the classic studies on this is entitled Love and Desire. It was published in 1912 and really focused on two opposing themes within romance. One is love, which in that paper was really meant to include attachment and dependence or interdependence between individuals, right? And the other end of the spectrum being desire or the sexual desire for another. And romance was meant to encapsulate both those things, love and desire. And for much of the 1900s, it was thought that love and desire were on sort of opposing ends or in kind of a push-pull. And it was the dynamic push and pull between love and desire that one could define romance. And that actually led to much of what's out there in the psychological literature. Today, we are going to explore some neurobiological studies, some studies of the endocrine system, meaning the hormone system, that actually support that general model. And I'll point you toward what I think is a very useful book in thinking about how relationships can both form and last over long periods of time, and how those relationships can include both desire and interdependence. I'll also talk about some studies that have really focused on why relationships succeed and why they fail, and how that relates to whether or not there is sufficient amounts of attachment and desire. So today we're going to talk about the science, and indeed you'll also get some tools. Those tools should be useful to you whether or not you happen to be in a relationship or not, whether or not you're seeking a relationship or not. I'd like to begin with an anecdote, and this is not an anecdote about my relationship history. It's an anecdote about my scientific history. When I started graduate school, the chairman of the department I was in at the time said to me, "You know, most PhDs last longer than most marriages." And indeed, he was right. And also, most marriages in this country end in divorce. I think it's about 50%, with a slight skew toward more ending in divorce than persist until death do them part. But nonetheless, it's about half, and most marriages end before the 8-year period is up. Most PhDs take anywhere from 4 to 9 years. So there was a bit of a smearing of averages there. But the point he was trying to make really landed home for me. It did not scare me out of relationships, nor did it scare me out of a PhD, obviously. What it did illustrate was that there's something about our attachment machinery that can be very, very compelling, such that people take on tremendous levels of commitment. I have to imagine that most people enter marriages assuming that they're going to stay in those marriages. I don't think most people enter marriages thinking they're going to get divorced. But that if 50% of those commitments end in divorce, there must also be mechanisms by which our attachments can break. And today we're going to talk about both the forming of attachments and the breaking of attachments, what can prevent those breaks in attachments, and indeed what can lead to reattachments.